Welcome to the Seahawkers podcast. I'm Brandon Schultz of the Military Seahawkers, and the NFL Combine is coming up this week. It's all leading up to the NFL Draft, coming up April 23rd through April 25th. But to get there, we go through the NFL Combine. We get to see what happens, how these players perform, and here to talk about it is Rob Staton of SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Rob, it's another year of the NFL Combine, but it sounds like we have some changes to what's coming up this year.
Yeah, there's a complete schedule change, Brandon. So it's not going to be a Friday to Monday event this year. It's going to be Thursday. It starts on Thursday, the workouts at least, with the tight ends, the quarterbacks, and the wide receivers. It all ends on Sunday with the defensive backs. They've changed the drills. They've taken away some of the different tests and drills that they do. They've incorporated some new ones. We're going to see various things like the gauntlet drill, which people remember is when the receivers run down a line and, quarterbacks throw them different footballs from different angles and they have to try and catch them as they run down the line. That's going to be timed now. So we're going to be comparing loads of different tests in terms of timing as well. And it's a prime time schedule now. So instead of it being on first thing in the morning and then going on throughout the day, it's going to start 4 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, and 2 p.m. Eastern time on Sunday. It's going to go on and into the evening, and they're hoping to bring in a new audience for this Combine event. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, how it affects the players, whether the teams like the changes or not, and we're going to get to find out together.
Well, I don't envy you for the fact that you're probably going to be staying up until 3 or 4 in the morning now. But for people on Seattle local time, this is going to be done right about 8 in the evening. So you can come home and watch these drills and, you can be done before it's bedtime, unlike the East Coast where they're going to be up till almost 11 at night. But it is interesting to see how they've changed this, to try and make it a spectator type event in the evening. I know that the coaches and GMs are having to adjust because they've moved the interviews now. Those used to be taking place in the evenings, and now they've moved them to the morning. And I think they've even dialed them back so they can, and now they have a more limited number of, I think, 45 interviews that they can do between the coaches and GMs, where that number was higher in the past. So everybody is going to have to adjust to this new schedule this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've got to give it a chance. You've got to see how it plays out. I didn't personally feel at the moment it kind of feels like the NFL is trying to fix things that aren't broken. So, hey, the 16 game schedule works really well. Let's throw in another game. Let's have a 17th game there. Let's do all these different things. Let's change the combine to prime time. These are things that I think over the years you kind of become familiar with, and things happen a certain way. And I'm not someone who's not receptive to change, but it kind of feels like at the moment a lot of things are changing for the sake of chasing even more money or an even greater audience. And you kind of think, well, isn't the NFL doing well enough as it is? Does it really need to do all these things? Does it need to reinvent the wheel? Well, let's see how it goes. At the end of the day, Combine's still a great event, whether it takes place first thing in the morning, last thing at night, whether it means I have to stay up till 4 o'clock in the morning, or whether it's done by, middle of the evening, like it used to be done for me, which was perfect. Now what we're going to get at a Combine is a whole heap of information. And because we've had 10 years of Pete Carroll and John Schneider, we generally know the kind of physical profiles that they look for at each position. We can kind of pick through lists and identify players and focus on certain prospects and get into sort of really getting to know them as opposed to just a broader class. And, we no longer have to say if this player has 33-inch arms, the Seahawks might consider him, or if this player, has an explosive tester, if this player runs a good short shuttle, they might consider him. We can definitively say this player has got length, he has got speed, he has got agility. He's going to be on Seattle's radar likely. So, it provides us with a whole host of new information. It also means that there's going to be lots of reports and rumors about what's going to happen in free agency, which is going to be particularly interesting for the Seahawks this year because they've got a lot to get done and they've got a lot of cap space. They've got some draft picks that they could use via trades. And then we're going to build up to free agency as well after that. So very busy period, very exciting period for Seahawks fans.
And yet with all this information that we have, Rob, it seems like every year we get a surprise pick from Pete Carroll and John Schneider. But I do like the fact that now over these years, now that we have all of this data, like you mentioned, it does give us an idea of where to narrow the focus in a lot of cases. And I want to do that going position by position because it does seem like they have particular types that they look for in terms of times, whether it's short shuttle or 40-yard dash times or even 3-cone drill times. There are certain things that they look for, and it can differ by position. But before we get into that, let's talk about the drills overall, because so much importance I feel like in the past of watching the combine, it gets placed on the 40-yard dash times. That feels like the main spectator event that they like to feature when you're watching NFL Network or ESPN. But for those guys who play on the offensive line, for example, it doesn't make sense to put that much stock in a 40-yard dash time. You know, your right tackle and left tackles aren't going to be running 40 yards very often. And so, you know, hopefully they start showing the 10-yard split times in those cases a little bit more. I know we've talked about in the past how they don't really put those numbers up on the screen. But is there one drill to you, Rob, that stands above all the others as you feel being the one that is most important to watch?
Yeah, I think that specifically, if you were talking about offensive linemen, you would talk about other things. But I think overall, the most important one is probably the short shuttle. I don't think a lot of people are aware of this. It's not something that gets talked about a lot very often. The quote that I like to use on this was on the NFL website before Mike Mayock became the GM of the now Las Vegas Raiders. He did a series of videos which are breaking down the different tests and the importance of them and what people were looking for. And he talked about the short shuttle, and he says it's important for literally every position. Why? For the little guys, it's obvious: quickness, acceleration, change of direction. And for the bigger guys, can they bend? Are you a natural bender? Are you a heavy-legged waist bender? That's one of his favorite quotes. And he talked about those various things. And actually, as the years have kind of gone on, I found myself writing more and more post-combine about the short shuttle because you could see little trends there. So, for example, with the tight end position, the Seahawks have really only targeted tight ends who've run very good short shuttles. So, you know, Luke Wilson ran a 4.29, which was incredibly fast. Nick Vannett, a 4.20, which is a superb time. That was the second best short shuttle by a tight end in the 2016 draft. You know, Will Disley ran a 4.40. Zach Miller, who they signed in free agency, was a 4.42. And when you actually think about the Seahawks tight ends, you would say, well, they're not the greatest athletes. They're not, really dynamic 4.4 runners. They are more blocking. Like Will Disley's more of a blocking tight end. You would say Nick Vannett was drafted to be a wide tight end, not a move tight end. And yet they all ran these really fantastic short shuttles, which means that sort of short area change of direction, that agility, that ability to pivot and change and shift around it in small areas is something that they've focused on quite a lot. And then when you actually run through it, for the defensive linemen, for the guys that they've taken, whether that's an inside-out rusher, whether it's an edge rusher, again, they have spent a lot of time focusing on these short shuttles. So to give you an example, Bruce Irvin ran a 4.03, which is the kind of test you would, in the short shuttle, you'd expect from a cornerback. Bruce Irvin was about 250 pounds and a pass rusher. So you say, okay, that's an outstanding short shuttle. And that's why they took him, that short area quickness, that burst, that ability to bend around the edge, that ability to change direction at a difficult angle. Frank Clark was 275 pounds at his combine. He ran a 4.05, which was marginally slower than Bruce Irvin's time. Cassius Marsh ran a 4.25. Obun Gwachin a 4.28. These are elite times for people of those positions. When you actually look at the defensive tackles they've drafted, people like Rasheem Green running a 4.39, which you'd expect again from a defensive back. Quinton Jefferson a 4.37, even quicker. Jordan Hill a 4.51. Jay Howard a 4.47. Malik McDowell a 4.53. The evidence is all there that the Seahawks have really looked at the short shuttle, quick short shuttle times have been vital for their defensive tackles and defensive ends that they have taken. And then when you actually look at the cornerbacks as well, I just pulled up all of the data. And whether it was DeAndre Elliott or Ty Smith or Trey Flowers or Richard Sherman or Shaquille Griffin, they all ran really good short shuttle times. So, yeah, you're right. A lot of people focus on the 40-yard dash. I think with offensive linemen, the things to focus on are explosive traits. That is the broad jump, the vertical jump, the bench press, combine those together. We put a formula together to do that. Pretty much every position. The one thing I think to focus on more than anything is probably the short shuttle.
The evidence is there that they do look for it. I wonder, though, I can't help but thinking, especially when you bring up Nick Vannett's name and thinking back to the 2016 draft, should they put that much stock into it? Because you think of Hunter Henry being the first tight end off the board, I think. At least he went early in the second round. Austin Hooper went in the third round, and he had some athletic traits as well. But Nick Vannett, he went toward the end of the third round, and fourth round, Tyler Higbee went to the Rams. So of those four guys, Nick Vannett's probably the one that I like the least.
Yeah, I mean, I think in draft position, though, obviously, I'm just going to have a quick look now. I mean, the Seahawks had other things they had to get.
Oh, sure.
I mean, that was the 2016 draft. Right. So So first and foremost, I mean, the Seahawks went into that draft absolutely needing a right tackle. They had to come out. They didn't have an option at all at right tackle. And, we talked about Jermaine Ifedi. We mocked Jermaine Ifedi to the Seahawks because he fit their explosive preference for offensive linemen and the length and the size that he had. He seemed like a very obvious fit in the late first round. For the Seahawks, they had to get that one done.
Jaron Reed ended up falling late in the second round. I don't think that they expected that, so then they traded up to get him, and that could have changed everything.
And that possibly so. I mean, I had Jaron Reed. I think I mocked him number 16 to Detroit in the first round, and then he's there in what a pick 49 it was, and they traded up, and you could see. I can remember there's a great clip of John Schneider after they traded up for him, kind of just shrugging his shoulders, and they were all looking out the room in amazement that Jaron Reed was still there. They clearly had a first round grade on him, and then traded up to go and get him. And then you're looking at who's left in round 3, and obviously Hunter Henry, who ran a great short shuttle of 4.41, and Austin Hooper ran, I think, a 4.37. They were both really, really good times. And Nick Vanette's not had a great career so far. I'd be surprised at this stage, let's say, if he was something to go on and emerge and be really good in the future. But, I think from that, they were kind of like limited by the options that they had left on the board in 2016. But the thing about this is that focusing on specific tests and saying, well, okay, maybe they shouldn't focus on this enough because certain players have not worked out. I think with any kind of test, what you're really doing is you're establishing what an ideal is. What does an ideal prospect in your system look like? And at certain positions, they're going to have certain aspects of their profile which you look for. And if you do it that way, one, it can help you refine the types of players that you're looking for. And that can be a big positive thing in having clarity and in sort of knowing what you're looking for in a draft when you've got like 300-400 players and you've got to narrow it down to like 100. That can be a really positive thing. But you are going to have picks that don't work out. Seahawks fans will tell you, oh, look, they've not had a good draft in 5 years or whatever. Some of these picks are not going to work out. But it's this same methodology which led them to your Cam Chancellors, your Richard Shermans, your Bobby Wagners, your Russell Wilsons, and Earl Thomas and people like that. So you can't have it both ways. Their plan to an extent has worked very, very well. It landed them the first ever championship we've had in Seattle. And it's that process they're going to be relying on again, presumably move forward to try and get them a second one.
Well, let's go through day by day and talk about position by position what you think that people should watch for in terms of the combine, because now with it being in prime time, more people are going to be able to watch. And so it'll give folks a better idea of what to look for as they're watching. And on the first day, Thursday, the 27th of actual on-field drills, they're going to be doing measurements and that kind of thing too. I think Thursday is the day that we actually get the arm lengths for the cornerbacks, for example. But as far as televised events, you're going to have the tight ends out there, the quarterbacks, the wide receivers. Tight end, less of a need now for the Seahawks. Quarterback, obviously not a need. So let's start with wide receiver. And while we've just talked about the importance of the short shuttle, in terms of wide receivers, the 40-yard dash is actually very important for players to pass to become a Seahawks wide receiver.
Absolutely. Pete Carroll's only drafted 3 receivers who haven't run a 4.40 or faster, and they were all drafted in the later rounds. So Kenny Lawler was a 7th round pick. Chris Harper ran a 4.50, so it was as close to being a 4.4 as you can get, and he was around 4. And then John Asua last year, they traded back into round 7 to get him. He ran a 4.56. So if we're talking about drafting a receiver, let's say within the first 3 or 4 rounds, they almost certainly, it's always been a person who's run a 4.4, whatever, 4.49 or faster, for them to be a Seahawks candidate. And I can run through the list very quickly. Paul Richardson ran a 4.40, Golden Tate at 4.42, Tyler Lockett at 4.40, Chris Durham at 4.46, Kevin Norwood 4.48, Amara Darbo 4.45, David Moore 4.42, and then DK Metcalf a 4.33. And regardless of whether they're a big hulking receiver like DK Metcalf, a taller guy like Chris Durham, or the more diminutive types like Tyler Lockett or Golden Tate, speed has been something that Seahawks say you've got to have speed, and that, that's an understandable thing because suddenness and that ability to create separation is the most important thing at the wide receiver position. It's even more important now. Teams have kind of moved away from the classic possession receiver types, and they are now looking for guys who have got that suddenness and quickness, can create that easy separation, can get downfield, but can also win whether they're outside, whether they're playing in the slot. That's what teams are looking for. We've seen guys like Antonio Brown over the years emerge as like top receivers in the NFL, as opposed to those big, hulking, 6'4", not particularly fast, but box out and win contested catches types. So speed matters. This is a draft class that is loaded with fast receivers, and it's just a question of, which ones run the 4.4 or faster. Put them on a great big list. They're in contention for the Seahawks.
Well, at each of these positions, if you go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com, you have 5 players to watch. And I think you hit on 4 of them that ended up with the Seahawks when you go throughout last year's, the 2019 look at the draft. And this year, you have 5 guys listed at wide receiver. Brandon Ayuk, who I know we've talked a lot about from Arizona State, Jalen Reagor from TCU, Henry Ruggs from Alabama, KJ Halmer from Penn State, and Brian Edwards of South Carolina. As I look through these 5 guys, I want to know, Rob, do any of these 5 players stand out as just a natural slot receiver, or how about a guy with kick and punt return experience? Because I feel like that's going to give players an edge up to make the Seattle roster this year.
Well, Ayuk, Reagor, and Hamler all have a lot of kick return experience. They've all been really good kick returners, and they could easily do that role for the Seahawks in their rookie season and be sort of like the number 3 receiver alongside Lockett and Metcalf. So I would say yes. First of all, that's what I would say. For the slot, I think that KJ Hamler is absolutely a dynamite in the slot. He has a very, very good ability to find soft areas in zone, to win against mismatches when he's lined up against a linebacker, and then once you get the ball in his hands in the open field, he can make magic happen. Brian Edwards is very good at working in the slot. It's been announced today that he's not going to be working. He's broken his foot, sadly, in combine training. So he's not actually going to be able to work out the combine, which is a huge shame. But he's somebody that could remain on the Seahawks radar. Brandon Ayuk, for me, it's kind of a little bit unproven that he could work in the slot. He's predominantly been used outside and wide receiver screens. Reagor, likewise, I think is more, kind of wins at the red line and can box out and can at least got fantastic vertical ability. He's going to do a brilliant job in the vertical jump, can leap higher than everybody else, win in the red zone, win those contested catch on the red line. Henry Ruggs, I could easily see him working into the slot. His speed is incredible. I think he's going to run in this is not new news. Everybody expects him to run a 4.2. He's been talked about so much, but when that happens, I think he's going to go a lot higher than people are currently projecting. I think that if he runs a 4.2, I think Denver at 15 is going to be his floor. That's the lowest point that he could go at. But there's 5 names. I mean, I could reel you off many, many more names. I mean, this is such a strong wide receiver class that there are loads and loads of players that the Seahawks, they will find somebody. I mean, I personally feel like they have to tap into this class at some stage. It's just too good of a wide receiver class to miss out on completely. So I think within the first 3 rounds, they will draft a wide receiver, and it's just a case of who's going to run in themselves into the kind of contention for the Seahawks to take.
So other than the 40-yard dash, which drills should people really be watching with wide receiver?
I think vertical jump's really important. Jalen Reagor is not a tall guy. He's probably going to measure about 5'9", 5'10", although he has got that kind of Deebo Samuel, Golden Tate, lower body. He's quite a well-built, smaller receiver, if that makes sense. But he's small. He's not a tall guy. And then yet you watch him in the red zone, and he's leaping above much bigger defensive backs to high point the ball way above them, because he's got this like 38, 39, 40-inch vertical. I mean, he's just an incredibly explosive player, and that is what is going to matter. If you've got the speed to get downfield and that speed to win with early separation, when the ball's in the air as well, maybe if you haven't got that separation, you have to go up and get it in the red zone. Can you get above everybody else, go and high point that football? So I think a vertical jump is definitely something. And the catching drills are also really important. Catching technique is something that I think is an underrated factor. So what you're looking at is when they're doing the gauntlet, when they're running the routes and getting downfield, are they cupping their hands to the ball? Are they catching it very naturally? They're not allowing it into their body. They're not sort of clapping their hands together like a crocodile to try and catch the football. They're not fighting the football. You see a lot of receivers do that, fight the football. DK Metcalf, in fairness, does that a little too often. It's something that he's going to work on. And the other thing is when they're throwing the deep ball, do they track the ball over their shoulder very comfortably? That's something that's very difficult to do. It's an underrated skill in the NFL. It amazes me that wide receivers do it as well as they do into these 100-mile-an-hour football games, and they just track the ball over the shoulder downfield. But they do a drill specifically for that. Watch them to see their catching technique and their ability to track the ball. Both very, very important aspects.
Well, watching the receivers catch the deep balls, we're also going to be watching the quarterbacks throw deep balls. And we know that's very important to a Seahawks offense. And I feel like, Rob, we talk about it every year. Could the Seahawks, could they actually find a longer term option at backup quarterback this year? Because, I mean, the reason why it's particularly relevant this year is just how many free agent quarterbacks there will be. And so maybe it'll be a better question to ask once all the quarterbacks are settled. But I think the reason why the Seahawks have been out in the draft is just because how overvalued quarterbacks tend to get. So I wonder if quarterback value in this draft will be diminished a little bit with all of the free agent options. But considering that value, if you're taking a position other than quarterback by the time it gets to the 6th and 7th round, there really aren't any other players who can come in and be a competent backup. Last year, I think Gardner Minshew, he fell to the 6th round. He could have been a fit. But, maybe even if the Seahawks, if they have a pick and early in the 6th round, maybe they take Travis Homer just because of the special teams value that they had to him at that point. So I just wonder, could this be the year that they find a competent backup?
Potentially so. I mean, there's a couple of names that stand out to me. There could always be like that smaller school quarterback that don't have a great access to the tape, as sort of amateurs on the outside looking in. Maybe the teams have, know a lot more about the sort of the smaller school guys. But the two names that I kind of would look at as potential for this, one is Steven Montez at Colorado, who is incredibly talented. He's very big, great arm, very mobile, can get the ball downfield. He's a lot taller than Russell Wilson. Most quarterbacks are. That's no slight on Russell Wilson. Right. But he showed flashes at Colorado. The problem was consistency with him. Now, if he was there, let's say round 6, round 7, and no one's decided to take a chance on him, could he be somebody that you come in, you try and work with, you try and develop, and could become a cheap backup for this team? Yes, I think that would be a potential option there. The other player that I kind of think of that could do this is Jalen Hurts. Now, Jalen Hurts we have to see what his stock. I mean, like some people still think he could be, 2nd or 3rd round pick. I don't think we've seen enough from him either at Alabama or at Oklahoma or at the Senior Bowl to think that he's going to be a high pick. I mean, personally for me, I think he's a day 3 prospect. Yeah. If he lasted to day 3, then you're talking about a guy that is mobile, that is similarly sized to Russell Wilson. You could probably fit him into the offense that the Seahawks run with Wilson without having to change anything major. He has been a winner in college. He's played a lot of games. He's had some football adversity, which is an underrated aspect. People talk about adversity in their lives, whether they've had family tragedies or they've had to grow up in a very difficult circumstance. That's all good for grit and determination and character building, but also football adversity. And he's facing challenges within your team. And for Jalen Hurts to lose his job to Tua Tagovailoa and carry on and not have a strop and decide he's going to quit the team or transfer halfway through a season or anything like that. No, he stuck with Alabama to the very end and provided a lot of value for them and had to come in playoff games and had to try and win them national championships. And that will not go unrecognized by teams. And then he went to Oklahoma when the time was right and he got them to the playoffs as well. So I think that when you look at all of that and the mobility and the creativity, I could see him being, if he did last into day 3, he's a great guy as well, really great character. Oh, yeah. I could imagine the Seahawks saying, do you know what? In this range value, we'll take him. He can be our backup we can develop for the next 4 years. So, but he would have to fall. I mean, obviously they're not going to take him in.
Oh yeah, round 5, 6, 7. That seems like especially based on the performances that we've seen from him in the BCS playoffs, in the Senior Bowl. It just seems like it doesn't seem like he's one of the top options.
That's it. For me, I think that it's hard not to have a lot of respect for the way that he went about his career, his college career, and the fact that he won so many games and that he handled the adversity like an absolute pro. But physically, I think there are limitations. I don't think he's the most accurate. I don't think he's going to threaten. But then we kind of said similar things about Gardner Minshew. I mean, when you actually right. when you watch Gardner Minshew at the Senior Bowl, his arm strength you just looked at it and thought, that's not going to work at the NFL. And then you watch him play for Jacksonville, and he was an absolute magician. And you just think, how's he doing this? And he looked at home in the NFL, and he should be starting for Jacksonville next year for me. I mean, he just showed so much and created excitement around a franchise that absolutely needed it. So, who knows? Maybe that could be like Jalen Hurts as well. But, when you actually look at him, you think, like Minshew, you could just see him maybe dropping a little bit into day 3, between rounds 4 and 7. If he grades out well and if you've managed to address some other needs, perhaps that's something you do to save a bit of money. Save some money on a backup quarterback who you can develop. And, down the line, they can become good trade pieces as well. I mean, look at some of the quarterbacks who've been moved over the years and have been drafted a little bit later on. So, yeah, I think that he'd be a name to keep an eye on if he was there on day 3.
Let's move on to tight end. And I'm kind of curious, now that the Seahawks have signed Greg Olsen, where do you think this falls in terms of priority? And I know you and I have talked about in the past that tight end, this particular tight end class may not be quite as strong. And I'm curious to know if this might still be a priority that they would go out and look for, because obviously Greg Olsen, probably not going to be here for more than 1 year, maybe 2 if we're lucky. And then they're going to have other pieces to move around. Jacob Hollister, as a number 3 tight end might be fine, but it wouldn't hurt to also have some competition for that spot as well.
I think there are a few things at play. I think this is not a very good tight end class. I mean, it's possible that we will have none taken in the top 50. And I know people have been mocking Cole Kmet to the first round and New England. That's kind of forcing it a little bit. And there are 1 or 2 other players who get mentioned. Harrison Bryant at Florida Atlantic's been touted as a second round pick. I don't think there's at least a decent chance we will not see any of these guys go in the top 50. So I think the Seahawks have kind of looked at this and thought, we need a tight end. We need to add a tight end at some point because Will Disley's coming back from injury. For the last 2 years, he's not been able to stay healthy. We're going to need something. And they've weighed it up. And do they spend $10 million a year or $12 million a year on Austin Hooper or Hunter Henry, or do they spend 7 on Greg Olsen? And the more I think about this, the more I like this move. And the reason is because if you sign Austin Hooper to a big contract, you are tied to Austin Hooper. He is your starting tight end. Will Disley is your number 2 tight end. Yeah. You're not going to have you're also probably not going to pay Will Disley and Austin Hooper as well. So Austin Hooper is your guy at tight end. I don't think they're ready to move on from Uncle Will just yet. I think they want to give him every opportunity to be the Seahawks tight end for the next 8-10 years. I think they love his attitude. They love what he brings on the field. When he's played, he has looked fantastic, hasn't he? And I don't think they're ready to give up on him. And I think the great thing about the Greg Olsen deal is it means they bring somebody else in. Yeah, it's a little bit expensive, but Greg Olsen still had 500 yards last year, and in 14 games, and still produced at a decent level. So they bring Greg Olsen in. It's insurance against further injuries for Will Disley. They have the 2 of them there. They'll probably bring back Jacob Hollister as well. So then you've got 3 guys there, and you know what? You've still got question marks for the long term. Can Disley stay healthy? Is Greg Olsen going to be a factor for you for more than 1 year? Can Hollister come back and contribute as well? It's not the year to address that in the draft or free agency for me anyway. So you kind of push the problem into next year. And in the meantime, you give Will Disley the chance to come forward and be the future of the position. And Greg Olsen can help you out in the meantime. So I actually don't think this is going to be a position that they look for in the draft. But if you want to keep an eye on it, short shuttle times, just, after the workout, see what the short shuttle times are. If there's a guy running a 4.4 or faster, again, that's the kind of time you're looking for there. And just general athletes, is there somebody who really stands out, has got the length, got the blocking ability, has a great workout, with a great vertical jump and broad jump and runs a great 40. If there's a special athlete in there, the Seahawks may well consider them at some point. But I think with the Olsen signing, that was a big statement on this draft class, that they're pushing this problem down the line and hoping that Will Disley can be the answer.
Well, let's move on to day 2 of the on-field performances, where we see offensive line and running back, and I think special teams, which we probably don't need to cover. But let's go to offensive line. In the years past, Rob, we've talked about the trench explosion formula, or TEF, which is something that you've put together based on some information that we heard from way back from Tom Cable about the traits that the Seahawks tend to look for in terms of their offensive linemen. And going back to last year, one of the questions that we had going into that draft in 2019 is if we would learn whether or not these were traits that were exclusive to Tom Cable, or if these were traits that Pete Carroll and John Schneider look for. Phil Haynes was selected last year and had the second highest score in your weighted TEF rankings, which accounts for a player's weight and how that impacts their explosiveness. So let's talk about TEF a little bit, because it does appear that it still matters. And which drills go into it and why it's important, not just to the Seahawks.
Explosive traits are really important in the trenches. I will quote what I've written in the Combine preview, which is a piece by Pat Kerwin, who is close to Pete Carroll. He's a journalist, he used to work in the NFL. And he says, every time a ball is snapped to start a play, there's a critical element of explosiveness that takes place. When 2 players collide in an attempt to physically dominate each other, the athlete with the edge in explosiveness has the best chance to win the confrontation. It could be a blocker versus a tackler versus a ball carrier, or many other examples of winning at the point of contact. So, you in the trenches, you've just got two guys plowing into each other, down after down after down. And if you have a big explosive offensive line, then you've got a better opportunity to win some of those battles. Now, what happened was there was a town hall interview after the Seahawks won the Super Bowl with Tom Cable, and Tom Cable was talking about what they look for in offensive linemen, and he said the ideal was a 31-inch vertical, a 9-foot broad jump, and at least 30 reps on the bench press. That was very specific. I'm not sure whether the Seahawks appreciated him sharing that information, given that we've written about it for the last few years, but it was very specific. And, because you have those things, you can build a formula to say, well, look, these are the ideals, and you can do it on a scale. So anybody who falls below those ideals, and anybody who falls above them, you can kind of measure it, which we did. And it was, we did it, and Jermaine Ifedi was drafted very early, and then it seemed that you could go back in time and you could backdate it and go and see that nearly all of the offensive linemen that they drafted had sort of essentially worked into this formula. They'd all had these ideal scores or higher. And then when Cable left, as you mentioned, we were kind of unsure if they moved on, because clearly Mike Solari was bringing in bigger offensive linemen, your DJ Flukers and people like that. Size seemed to be more important. So was it going to change? Were they just going to look for these big, man blocking, power blocking type guys instead of explosive guys? And then Phil Haynes comes along, the second top TEF tester last year, second most explosive offensive lineman in the draft, and they take him. So that suggests that they're still looking at it. And it matters. It's not just a Seahawks thing either. And this is why I think it still has some relevance now. That the Haynes thing kind of confirmed it a little bit to us. But I think that it has more importance because the NFL is paying attention to this. So here's, when I was looking at writing this piece for the Combine preview, here's what I found. That 2 years ago, so we're talking about the 2018 draft, there was only 7 offensive linemen who scored what we would consider, an optimal score for TEF that would match Cable's suggested ideals. So only 7 offensive linemen. One was Quentin Nelson, who went in the top 10. Mm-hmm. One was Colton Miller, who had a very explosive workout, went a lot higher, if people remember, in round 1 to the Raiders than many people were expecting. So they were both high first-round picks. Then you had Braden Smith, who was the most explosive offensive lineman in that draft, went at the top of the second round. You've got Connor Williams, who I think Dallas traded up to get. And you've got Will Hernandez, who went, again, at the very top of the second round to the Giants. They were all second-round picks. Then in the last draft, only 8 players scored an optimal score in TEF. Chris Lindstrom ended up going much higher in the draft than anybody expected. He was a first-round pick to Atlanta. Garrett Bradbury went very, very early to the Minnesota Vikings. He went 18 overall to the Vikings. Explosive player. Andre Dillard ended up going in the first round. Kind of came from nowhere through the process. Ended up going in the first round to the Eagles. And then Caleb McGarry from Washington ended up going in the late first round again to Atlanta. They took 2 explosive offensive linemen. They were all drafted in round 1. And then in round 2, you've got Eric McCoy and Elton Jenkins, who were both top 50 picks. So pretty much all of the explosive offensive linemen that have tested at the Combine in the last 2 years have been taken in the first round or the top 50, which, that to me suggests that it's not a Seahawks thing. It's an NFL thing. The NFL wants explosive offensive linemen.
Yeah, and, when you bring up some of those names and you go back to the 2018 draft, it makes sense with Quentin Nelson, especially being the first lineman taken overall. But he also had a lot of college talent as well. So him being that number 6 overall pick was, I think, kind of a no-brainer for the Indianapolis Colts. He ends up making the Pro Bowl. And the only other guy, though, to make the Pro Bowl from that 2018 draft is a guy who didn't test particularly well in explosive traits. And that was Orlando Brown, who fell all the way to the Ravens at number 83 in the 3rd round.
Yeah, he had a historically bad combine.
It was so bad.
I think he ran a near 6-second 40.
Right.
I think if they did, presumably they did the Rich Eisen, the video where they show him running and then they show the player side by side. Rich Eisen may have won that particular race, and I think he jumped like a 19 inch vertical or something, which I think you or I could probably jump that. So not a great test. I mean, the thing with Orlando Brown, I don't know what he was doing before that combine, but it wasn't good. And he was and the other thing was he was like 370 pounds. So this is why weighted TEF we did the TEF thing, and quite rightly at the time we were thinking, yeah, but it's if you're going to measure it, if you have an offensive lineman at 295 pounds, let's say it was like a Nick Harris type center, he could have a great explosive workout. But what about the guy who's 340 pounds? How can you measure those equally? Which is why we brought in weighted TEF, because it measures the fact that it gives the bigger guys an even better score if they manage to do these great testing numbers. And I think that's really important. And Orlando Brown, I just don't think his preparation was right for the combine. He was talked about as a first-round pick, in fairness, going into his combine. Mm-hmm. And it was the combine which sent him into round 3. So the talent was always there. And I suppose the other thing I'd say is that TEF is, and when we start the formula, it was never designed to say, these are the best defensive linemen, these are the players you should draft, these are the guys who are going to be a success in the league. It was simply designed to highlight potential Seahawks targets because we knew what their ideals were. And it just helped us, refine the talking points. So rather than talking about a class of 30 offensive linemen, these are the 5 that the Seahawks are most likely to draft. Let's dedicate our time to them. And then when they go and draft those guys, great. We know we've done a job as a blog. We've done the job. We've talked about the guys we needed to talk about, and that was what it was for. But it's not about determining who's necessarily going to be successful. And I think it's from the wider point of view of the league is that if they are looking for explosive offensive linemen, let's identify them. If these guys are likely to get a boost and go earlier, it's worth a discussion. If we're going to do a mock draft, if people are going to do a mock draft, if a guy turns up let's say, Mekhi Becton rocks with a combine and jumps a 35-inch vertical at 370 pounds, he's probably going to go in the top 5 because that's what the league's telling us. He's probably going to the Giants at number 4.
Yeah.
Because that will be such an incredible workout. We know the league values explosive traits. So those are the things that it's worth knowing as we kind of talk about the draft and we try and get to know things. But it doesn't guarantee success. That's the other thing to bear in mind. And there will be offensive linemen who don't test very well at the combine who go on and have success the same way that there's always Matt Judon who's going to be a free agent at Baltimore. Didn't test particularly well as a defensive end, but he had 9.5 sacks last year. He's probably going to get like $17 million a year in a few weeks' time. So maybe get the franchise tag. So there's always kind of exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, these are the players that the Seahawks and the league are looking for.
Yeah, well, even if you look at Jamarco Jones, he wasn't a guy that tested particularly well either at the draft. And I think in the case of him and in the case of Orlando Brown, when you have times that are so bad that it makes you question whether a person wants to play football or not, that can be what propels them downward in the draft as well. It doesn't necessarily have to do with, can they just not get a good time? It's that this is what you should be preparing for. And you came and showed up and looked as if you weren't prepared at all. So that can have a big impact on the draft as well. So a lot to watch there in terms of offensive line. Let's move on to running back. And I have to ask you, Rob, is there a more obvious position, apart from maybe cornerback, where the Seahawks have very specific traits that they're looking for a position?
Yeah, it's pretty clear, isn't it? They've the number of players that they have drafted and that have all kind of fit the same physical profile. Yeah, it's unbelievable how consistent they have been at this position. I mean, just to give you a little flavor of it, it's a guy who is about 5'10" to 6 foot. They generally weigh about 220 pounds. They have a very explosive testing workout, so a great vertical jump and a great broad jump. That is the quintessential Seahawks running back. And I think, if to take it a step further, they're the guys who play with real toughness on the field. When you watch Chris Carson, we watched Chris Carson, we identified him as a player that fit the physical profile that they look for. And then you put on the tape and you see him plowing into guys and driving them backwards, yards after contact, finishing runs, staying in bounds. And you say, yeah, that's the kind of guy that Pete Carroll likes. And we've seen it with him and with Thomas Rawls and with Marshawn Lynch and with Robert Turbin. Those are the kind of guys that they like. And they also like these special athletes, the Kristen Michael's workout. It's one of the greatest shames really in the last decade is that Kristen Michael never realized his potential. I mean, to be 5'10", 220 pounds and jump a 43-inch vertical.
Yeah.
I mean, that is just, he's a world-class athlete. He had talent as a running back as well. I mean, if he had the mentality of, I don't know, like a Tyler Lockett, for example.
Yeah.
He could be the best running back in the NFL. I mean, he could be on Todd Gurley money right now if he had that mentality, and he doesn't, sadly. So he's not. That's just the way it is. I mean, he fell asleep in too many meetings, unfortunately. But this is the type of player that the Seahawks are generally looking for. Over the years, we've been able to identify, who fits there. 2016, there was only 2 players who fit the bill: CJ Prosise and Kenneth Dixon. They took Prosise. In 2017, there was only 4: Chris Carson, Brian Hill, Alvin Kamara, and Joe Williams. They took Chris Carson. And then in 2018, it was a great running back class, and there was, 2, 4, 6, 8 players, I think, who fit the bill, and Rashad Penny was one of them. So, we identified him. They took him. They also ended up signing Bo Scarborough down the line, who's on the list. So it's been quite easy to sort of identify the types of running backs the Seahawks like. I think this running back class is underrated. I think there are going to be some headlines made by the runners at the combine. There are some special athletes, whether that's Clyde Edwards-Helaire is unbelievable. He's an unbelievable player. Whether he's drafted by the Seahawks or not, just watch this guy. He's going to have a fantastic career. You are going to end up loving him. Unless he plays for the 49ers, the Cardinals, or the Rams. You are going to end up loving him. You are going to end up loving this player. Buy into him. He's going to have an amazing combine. He's one of my favorite players that I've ever watched right in Seahawks draft.
Well, Rob, the 49ers aren't going to get him because I think they only have 1 pick in the first 4 rounds. So I don't think that's going to be where they go.
Thank goodness. I mean, and the Rams don't have any draft picks for the next 3 years, so it's not going to end up there either. Let's hope the Cardinals spend a lot of money on Kenyon Drake.
There we go.
I just think, I know that people don't like, there's a section of Seahawks fans that they don't want to talk about running game and running backs. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, my God, what a player. Just go and watch his videos on YouTube. Go and watch his games. Go and watch LSU. And then you find out what he did at Spark a few years ago at the same size that he is now, 5'8", 208 pounds. He ran a 4.04 short shuttle. That is a defensive back's time. That is a top-tier cornerback time for a short shuttle. That change of direction, that suddenness is unbelievable at his size. He ran a 4.47 40, so he's going to run in the 4.4s. He jumped a 40-inch vertical, which is marginally less than Christian Michael. This is just unbelievable testing. And he's going to get to the combine. He's an amazing character. He runs He's one of the most physical runners you will find. He's a brilliant receiver, runs great routes, catches the ball. Joe Burrow raves about this guy. Why did he win the Heisman, Joe? Because Clyde Edwards-Helaire was stood next to me in the backfield. That's pretty much what he says. This guy is incredible. So he's going to have a great test. J.K. Dobbins at Ohio State is going to just destroy this thing. He did jump a 43-inch vertical like Christian Michael at Spark. He had a 4.09 short shuttle, which is just a little bit slower than Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He finished with an elite Spark score of 146.76. He's going to be one of the top testers at the combine. Jonathan Taylor will run in the 4.3s at this combine, and he's 220 pounds. That is similar to the weight of DK Metcalf last year when he ran in the 4.3s. Jonathan Taylor is going to match that and run in the 4.3s at this combine, and people are going to be talking about him as a top 40 pick. And then you've got DeAndre Swift, who ran a great short shuttle at Spark, 33-inch vertical. He's not going to do as well as some of these guys. He's going to be up there. Florida State's Cam Akers is going to test brilliantly. A.J. Dillon at Boston College is going to test brilliantly. I'm a huge fan of Anthony McFarland. I think he's going to test pretty well. There are so many guys that are going to make headlines. The receivers are going to run fast. Your running backs are going to be explosive. I think it's a great offensive line class as well. Those 3 positions are going to blow this thing up this week.
Well, Russell Wilson had a little bit of pull, it seems like, with getting Greg Olsen to town. So maybe, he's looking at Jonathan Taylor, that Wisconsin running back, and saying to John Schneider, hey, let's get another one of my Wisconsin teammates on the team.
Listen, I'd be for it for every single thing. I love his cuts. I love his speed. I love his production. I love his second gear. I love his toughness. I love his character. What I don't like are the fumbles.
Oh.
I think he's had like 15 in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And the Seahawks just had a whole season fumbling the ball that many times in the season. So no thanks on that. Here's a stat for you, though, that I didn't mention with Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He didn't have a single fumble in 3 years at LSU.
Oh, wow.
So no fumbles, brilliant character, toughness, physicality, leadership, an elite physical profile. He's not 5'10" and 220 pounds, though. That's the thing. He's not the size. So
Right.
I can't say the Seahawks are going to draft Clyde Edwards-Helaire because I don't think they will, because he doesn't fit their profile. But at the same time, I love the guy. And if they took him with one of their 2 second-round picks and said, we just like him too much, we're going to take him, I'd say big thumbs up to that. And listen, a 5'10" quarterback wasn't their ideal either.
No.
If you look at it, they traded for Charlie Whitehurst, who's like 6'10". That's presumably Torrance Jackson wasn't small. So Russell Wilson wasn't the physical ideal. He was just too good. They had to have him. So maybe that'll be the same for Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I don't think he's going to end up in the Seahawks. I think someone's going to take him in the top, possibly the top 45. Atlanta Falcons, I could see taking him to be the heir apparent to Devonta Freeman. They may even cut Freeman. I could see them going in that direction. I just hope he ends up on an AFC team, and a team that I quite, I kind of have a soft spot for the Bills. So if he can't be with the Seahawks, go to the Bills. Let's see him run there. The Seahawks only have to face him this year and then not for another 4 years because he is such a good player.
Well, there are different segments of Seahawks fandom and the way they look at running backs. And some of them say, yeah, running backs don't matter at all. You can get them anytime. There's other people that say, yeah, well, not paying running backs is important, but having a good one is really, really important to the team. So with that in mind, a guy like Chris Carson going into the final year of his contract, wanting someone to move on from after you let hopefully Chris Carson go and allow another team to pay for his services, because especially if you fall within that camp of Seahawks fandom. And so maybe those people could be satisfied by getting a running back sometime in the late second or toward the middle of the draft as a potential heir apparent for Carson.
Yeah.
So
look, fans, I think even the fans who aren't supportive of Pete Carroll's philosophy on running the ball will like Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I mean, for me, he's kind of like the modern day. Is everything you'd want in a modern day running back. I mean, the fact is you can split him out wide. He did it all the time at LSU. He'd start off in the gun, they'd split him out wide as a receiver, he'd run a route. Watch the Alabama game. He runs a great route in the red zone. And then Joe Burrow throws in this ball. It's going to have to turn at the last minute and track the ball in the air. And he just made it look so easy. It was as if he was a receiver. The way he runs his routes, really, really good. But then if you want to run him up the gut on 3rd or 4th and 1, he'll hit the line of scrimmage. If he has to batter somebody out the way and get across the line for a first down, he'll do it. If you want to get him outside and get to the perimeter and try and bounce him out for a big gain, he can do it. He's got that shiftiness to find a hole and explode through it and make a huge gain. He's also got that real quickness and burst to just sort of attack the line and get through and get these explosive plays. And, I'm with you. I like Chris Carson. Who doesn't like Chris Carson? Fantastic running back, really, really talented, but has got a bit of a checkered injury history. And
a fumbling problem from this past season.
Has had a huge fumbling problem. He's got 1 year left on his deal. And look, I'm guessing he would get a decent contract. I mean, this is the thing. But if the Titans don't even franchise Derrick Henry, then can Chris Carson really expect to get a huge salary? I mean, it might actually be available on a discount. People see Todd Gurley and say that's not really worked out. They look at Zeke Elliott's contract, that's not really worked out. Let's see what happens with Derrick Henry once he gets paid. It might actually not help Chris Carson to go into next year out of contract. There may not be a load of teams queuing up to give him a huge salary, so the Seahawks might actually even get a bargain in retaining him. So that's front of the day. But set yourself up maybe to plan ahead, especially with Rashad Penny's injury now, to consider one of these guys. I don't think it's likely. I love Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I don't think they're going to take him early. I think what they will do is replace CJ Prosise in the middle of the draft or the end of the draft or in undrafted free agency, and they will say, look, we've got Rashad Penny, we spent a first-round pick on him, we like Chris Carson, we'll get Joshua Kelly or somebody like that from UCLA to fill in, and who's a good receiver and who's quite quick. They'll do something like that to replace Prosise and call it a day. It's not a bad plan. Nothing against that. I just so love to see Clyde Edwards-Helaire in a Seahawks uniform because I think he's such a good player. And if not him, I think J.K. Dobbins is really good, and he too will probably go very, very early and out of range for the Seahawks. But let's see.
Last year, I gave you a hard time, Rob, for not including Miles Sanders among all these running backs that you and I talked about last season. And now I think the fact that you didn't bring up Zach Moss from Utah, I'm going to have to hit you on that one.
Listen, you know what? It's funny you mentioned that. I was just thinking that is a name I haven't brought up in all of this conversation because he has got the size that they look for, and he's got the attitude that they look for. They want running backs who get yards after contact and are physical and really inspire. It's one of the things, in this whole running, I don't want to get into the running game argument thing, but when you see a great run, a great physical run, the amount of energy that provides a sideline, you kind of see it. And Zach Moss was doing that for Utah. Runs somebody over, and even the defensive players are hollering on the sideline. And that's what Marshawn did for the Seahawks, for the LOB, and for the Seahawks defense. I'm going to bring him up again. Clyde Edwards-Helaire. You should see all these LSU games when he's by their sideline, runs somebody over, makes a move, and you just see everybody lights up, and that really energizes the team, and it sucks the life out of an opponent as well. And Zach Moss does a bit of that too. So yeah, he definitely warrants bringing up. Let's see how he tests at the combine.
Well, and one thing that jumped out to me from watching some of the Zach Moss tape was his pass blocking.
Yeah, and I think that he and J.K. Dobbins is good at that as well. I think it's the rest of the guys, including my favorite Edwards-Helaire, have got a bit of work to do there. But I think, like I said, I think it's an underrated running back class. I don't think it's a position the Seahawks will take early, but if they did, a lot of people will complain about it, but I won't, because I think there's some good players.
Well, we have clearly established who your favorite running back is, Rob. Let's move on to day 3, Saturday, where the defensive line and linebackers are going to be competing. And, you talked about measuring Tef on the offensive line, but it is the trench explosion formula. There's another aspect to the trench on the defensive side. Have you noticed any correlation at all to the Seahawks selecting guys who have the explosive traits on the defensive side of the ball?
I haven't. It doesn't seem to be something that they pay a lot of focus to. They have not necessarily, they've looked for explosive traits on the offensive line, but they seem to be looking for that quickness and agility, which kind of makes some sense. I suppose as a blocker, you want to get in there, overpower defenders, create running lanes, dominate in pass protection physically. I think that's what you look for with the offensive line. With the defensive guys, you want to actually avoid maybe some of the contact. You want to, get away from a grabbing offensive lineman, get into the backfield, disrupt, get tackles for a loss, create pressure, create sacks. So they've actually looked for that agility testing and that quickness a lot more than they have for explosive traits. But, a year ago, they went against the grain. And this was the very interesting thing in that, I talked earlier about what they look for in the defensive lineman. And LJ Collier had a very poor 40-yard dash, 4.91. He had a very poor 10-yard split, 1.75. He had a very poor short shuttle of 4.78. None of this is matched up with what the Seahawks would generally take at the position. But he did have quite a strong explosive following. He was powerful. He had a good vertical. He had a good broad jump. They liked the way that he operated at the Senior Bowl. I think one of the main reasons they took him is because of the story that Jim Nagy told us
Right.
when we interviewed him about him
barking at Tom Cable,
and everyone going, well, he just shout at Cable, and that's probably one of the reasons that played into it. They thought he could be Michael Bennett, who equally was not a good tester before his draft, and he went undrafted. So they thought that he could be that. But more often than not, they're not looking for explosive traits. They're looking for quickness and agility.
Well, we have talked about a lot of defensive linemen leading up to now, but of your 5 guys that you had listed among the defensive end and edge group, and one I don't remember talking about in particular is Jabari Zuniga from Florida.
Yeah, so Zuniga a year ago, he chose not to declare and was a player that, I actually mocked on one occasion to the Seahawks in the first round, thinking that they would need a defensive end. He chose not to declare. It was a bit of a surprise. He'd had a strong 2018 season and thought he may bolt for the draft. Didn't return to Florida and then had an injury-plagued final season with Florida. Had ankle injuries, was barely ever healthy, didn't have the kind of year that he wanted. He went to the Senior Bowl. This short clips that they showed on the Senior Bowl looked really bad, and he didn't have good time. But then Jim Nagy, who's a legend for doing this, posted on the Senior Bowl YouTube channel that I think is new, the full workouts for the defensive and offensive linemen, so we could watch every single snap. And I went and watched those, and Zuniga performed a lot better overall than my initial impression was. He's going to test very well. He's expected to have a very good testing session at the combine. If he does, he could be one of those players who's maybe around in round 2 or round 3 that you take a flyer on, because he has got some ability. He has got toughness. He can hold the edge against the run. He can get into the backfield. He's got bend. He's got quickness. So let's see how he tests and gets on at the combine to potentially be an option for the Seahawks. But the thing about the defensive line, it's not a great defensive line class. There's not a lot of depth. There's not a lot of talent that's going to go in the first round. But there are some guys that I like for the Seahawks that they could take. I think it's almost they've taken a defensive lineman, Brandon, with either their first or second pick for the last 5 years. They've done it every year for the last 5 drafts. It seems likely that will happen again now that they have defensive liners, in my opinion, by far their biggest need this year. So I think that one of their first 2 picks will probably go on a defensive lineman. It's just working out who, and it'll either be quick, agile, speedy rusher from the interior or the edge, or it's going to be somebody who just is a man against boys, like Raekwon Davis, who looks like Calais Campbell in his frame. Terrific run defender, great length, great traits. They love traits. See Raekwon Davis being on their radar. I love Rashard Lawrence at LSU. Just plays with his hair on fire, kicks everyone's ass on the defensive line. I just love the way that he played at LSU. I'd love to see him in Seattle. I think he's the kind of character that they've been going for recently. And then you look at the speed. Julian Okwara is really fast. Zuniga that we talked about. Let's see how Caleb on Chason works out. So there are some options for the Seahawks here.
In terms of drills, though, are there any things that people should be watching for? Because I think, that stat is really impressive when you think about the fact that, yes, they've taken a defensive lineman with one of those first 2 picks going back 5 years. So you can expect that it's probably a trend that's going to continue, especially considering their need for a defensive line. Holy smokes, unless they go crazy in free agency and really have a stacked defensive line until they get to the draft, I think there's a pretty good chance. And are there any particular drills just apart from, the basic things like short shuttle and 3-cone that are fun to watch for the defensive line?
Right. These are the things that you need to check off on your list for potential Seahawks in the defensive line. First of all, have they got 33-inch arms? They've consistently taken, whether that's defensive tackles or defensive ends, with length. Length is important for defensive linemen. It enables them to get leverage. They brought in Poona Ford, who's really short but has got great long arms. This is something that they pay a lot of attention to. So look down the list of measurements, find the defensive linemen who have got 33-inch arms or longer, because if they've got short arms, they're probably not going to be taken by the Seahawks. You want to look at the 10-yard splits, especially for edge rushers. That a great 40 is great. You're not running 40 yards to get to a quarterback. You're running very short burst, get off, acceleration from a stop-start. That is what you're looking for. So if you're looking for an edge rusher, anything in the 1.5s is an elite time. So what they will do when you're watching the combine is they will put the clock along the bottom. The player will set off and sprint. They will show you what his 40 time is. And then just above that, they put this little bar across and it tells you what the 10-yard split is. I'll put all this information on the blog anyway, but you can follow along and sort of see who are running the best 10-yard splits. And then you've got that information. And, that is something to really pay attention to on the edge rushers. And you mentioned the short shuttle there. Look, it doesn't hurt to be good at the vertical and broad jump as well. From the interior guys, again, that length, you want to see the 10-yard split. 1.5 is unrealistic. Anything in the 1.6s or early 1.7s is really good for a interior defensive lineman. Again, they've got to show that quick get off, that burst, that quickness to try and leave an offensive lineman on the heels a little bit there. And that agility, that short shuttle 3-cone, those kind of tests, as we already mentioned, they're the things I think you need to be looking at for the defensive lineman in this draft. Physicality and the toughness and the stuff like that. They've not defended the run well at all in the last couple of years. And, if they lose Jaron Reed, they're going to need somebody who can anchor that line. That's why I think Raekwon Davis is a good option for them either in round 1 or round 2, because he's massive. He looks like Calais Campbell. He's tall, 6'7", but doesn't have any issues with leverage, great bend, natural athlete. I don't know if he's going to run a great short shuttle. I don't know if he's going to run a great 40-yard dash or a 10-yard split, but he's powerful. He defends the run really well. He absorbs double teams. He can hit with power and play defensive end. He can kick inside. He's the type of player that they've gone for. There are some maturity issues there. And as they look for more leaders and great characters moving forward, I'm not sure whether that will work against him. But he's traded up to the nines. He's the type of player that they have generally looked for in that interior. Can be like a Tony McDaniel plus or a poor man's Calais Campbell. That's a good way of sort of putting him. Look for that as well. Just look for those guys who look the part, get off the bus first types.
I am curious about those interior defensive line guys, though, because, they have Poona Ford. They could potentially lose Jaron Reed, but I think free agency is going to be such a driver of where they go in the draft in terms of interior defensive line, because, gosh, I look down the list of free agents, Rob, and I just see so many good interior defenders that could stop the run, that could fill that Jaron Reed role, and maybe even get as much of a pass rush, maybe not the 10 plus sacks that Reed had a couple years back, but someone who can at least do some damage in the interior. So I think free agency is going to be a really important driver as to where they go in the draft with the interior line.
Absolutely, definitely so. There's so many things we could talk about today, but there's I think the thing with that is, one, they haven't spent a lot of money on the defensive interior. They've tried to find guys, an Al Woods, a Tony McDaniel, Clinton McDonald. They've tried to kind of fit guys in there, if that makes sense. And then they've drafted guys, cheaper contracts, your Jordan Hills, your Jaron Reeds, people like that. Poona Ford was an undrafted guy they brought in as well. They've seemingly tried to save money on the interior. And I don't think that's because they don't want a great interior pass. If Aaron Donald was there,
sure.
they'd pay him $1 billion and or 20 draft picks, whatever. But, they would love that kind of guy. But I think there's an acknowledgement of what their scheme is. It's a one gap system. It's about gap discipline and doing your job. And whereas like some other teams have more attack minded schemes and the defensive tackles are given a bit more freedom to get after it, the Seahawks don't really have that. And I kind of think they feel like, unless they're going to get a great interior guy, and I think they thought that Malik McDowell could be that, who can play any down and distance and provide pass rush as well as defend the run well. I think unless there's those kind of types, I think they're probably going to scrimp and save there. And we'll see what happens with Jaron Reed. I don't think they're going to go out and sign a DJ Reader, who's a nose tackle for $15 million a year or $10 million a year. I don't think, is Arik Armstead at $17, $18 million a year the direction they'll go? I'm not too sure on that. Mm-hmm. For me, I think what they're going to do is I think they're going to re-sign Jadeveon Clowney. I don't think his market is going to be market resetting. I don't think it's probably going to be in a similar range to DeMarcus Lawrence and Frank Clark. That's what I think, and I think they'll probably end up paying him that. And I think his first year cap hit will be. Frank's was $6.5 million. DeMarcus Lawrence's was 11. It's probably going to be between 6.5 and 10 million in year one. So they'll still be able to do other things. I think they're going to sign Everson Griffin to play across from him, and then it's a case of, is there enough money left to sign Jaron Reed, and can you add a couple of other pieces? And now, is that someone in the draft? Could be a speed rusher. Could be a Raekwon to play alongside Reed or to replace Jaron Reed and provide some good run defense. Or is there a trade opportunity? This is something that John Clayton's been talking about. He thinks they're going to re-sign Clowney, sign a pass rusher, so let's say Everson Griffin, and then he thinks they're going to trade for their answer to D Ford. So the 49ers a year ago traded a future second rounder for D Ford, who was franchise tagged by Kansas City. Now, there are some candidates out there that, whether it's Yannick Ngakoue or Chris Jones or other players like that who, I presumably Kansas City and Jacksonville will either want a high price or will want to keep all of those guys. But a year ago, Jadeveon Clowney was franchise tagged, and he said, I'm not having it. And they ended up getting a third rounder for him. So teams might want first round picks for these guys. Seahawks got it for Frank Clark. They also don't want to take up $20 million of their cap space on a player who's saying, I have no intention of signing with you. And, suddenly a future first rounder or a future second rounder or whatever can seem appealing like it did to Kansas City. So, let's see what they do with that. I don't think the Seahawks can do too much for their defensive line this year. And I think it's going to be very aggressive. I think that's going to be their area of focus. And I think it will involve free agency and the draft.
Well, the bonus with that, like you mentioned, with Yannick Ngakoue, with Jacksonville, it gives the team kind of that sole bargaining right if you propose a trade and it's accepted with the team, and then now you have an opportunity to work out a deal where other teams aren't a part of that bargaining process as part of free agency. So there can be some benefit to it.
Yeah, and look, the trade, you propose trades, as I've come to learn this week, and then people will say that's not going to happen, and more 99 out of 100 times that's right. These deals don't happen. But I always say, look, a year ago, if I'd have written an article saying the Seahawks should offer a third-round pick for Jadeveon Clowney, and to sweeten the deal, they should throw in Barkevious Mingo and Jacob Martin, people would go, that's insane. That's one of the worst things I've ever read. You should shut down the blog. And yet that's exactly what happened.
Right.
And you just don't know what's going to happen over the next few weeks. The NFL is unpredictable. Things happen that are unexpected. In 2013, who would have said the week before it happened that the Seahawks would trade for Percy Harvin and then sign Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill? We didn't even think they had the cap space to do that. They did all three. So you just don't know what's going to be out there, what deals there are to be done. I'm not saying that trading for Chris Jones and Yannick Ngakoue is likely or going to happen. I'm just saying that guys are going to get tagged who then become available like D Ford, and you just don't know what markets are going to happen. I mean, Dante Fowler could end up being a $17 million a year pass rusher, or he might have to take a 1-year prove-it deal again. Who knows? I mean, you just don't know. You have to wait and see. So, I think there's going to be options for the Seahawks. That's the good thing.
Well, let's move on to linebacker, who is also on that Saturday, along with the defensive lineman. And this is a spot where, when it comes to short shuttle and linebackers, this is a pretty wild stat that you pointed out on the blog, Rob. One third of players since Pete Carroll came into the NFL, so about 10 years, if you run a 4.1 or faster in the short shuttle, you then have a 33% chance of being a member of the Seahawks.
Yeah, some of those guys will just they'll just be taken too early for them or something like that, So, every year, Brandon, I try and write something down after the draft, a lesson for the following year. And a couple of years ago, we thought they had to fix the running game. I thought that anyway. Going into the 2018 draft, the running game had collapsed. Eddie Lacy was their running back. Kind of felt like they needed to do something here to fix this running game. And it talks about running backs, great running back class, read through all of the options. And then the week of the draft, I started talking, I saw a report that said the Seahawks were interested in Isaiah Oliver, that they might trade down and take Isaiah Oliver. And I ended up talking about that 2 days before the draft rather than the running back class. And then was kicking myself when they took Rashad Penny and thought, why did we spend 2 days talking about Isaiah Oliver before the draft when we should have been talking about the thing we talked about the whole offseason? It kind of felt like, we've got a whole bunch of people coming to the blog and they're thinking they're talking about taking a cornerback early, which they never do. And yet we talked about running backs. We should have stuck to our guns on that. So I kind of thought, right, okay, I need to learn from that. We all know, we're all Seahawks fans. We know kind of what they do by now after 10 years of this. Let's back ourselves to know more than outsiders. So that was that lesson from that. And then a year ago, I wrote down 4 things. One, that the biggest need is the biggest need. That if they go into the draft with a huge need, last year's defensive line, you better believe they're going to address it. They tackle their needs aggressively. So, they're going to do that this year. If they've not solved the defensive line issue, they will solve it. If they lose Fedi and Fant and don't have a right tackle, they'll draft a right tackle. They're just things that are going to happen in this draft if they're not addressed in free agency. And then the other things I wrote were look for Seahawks at every position, even if it isn't a huge need. Look for guys who are captains, who are physical and described as tough. And I noted that they don't always go for the fastest, most athletic guys because they took LJ Collier. Now, the second one is the interesting one. Look for Seahawks at every position, even if it isn't a huge need. Last year, they re-signed Bobby Wagner. They'd re-signed KJ Wright, and they re-signed Michael Kendricks. And I went into that draft thinking, there's no way they're going to draft. They're not going to spend valuable resources on it. They've only got 4 picks. Yeah. They're not going to take a linebacker.
And they took 2.
And they took 2. And they took 2. And the reason they took 2 is because they ran the short shuttle times that you just referenced there, that they were elite agility, short area quickness. And that is what they have looked for. Now, it helps that Cody Barton and Ben Burke-Irvin were good special teamers, had great character, had their toughness and all of that stuff as well. But they were among the best, quickest linebackers in the short shuttle in the last 10 years, and they took them both. They were Seahawks players. They were physically what they looked for at the position. And I never talked about them once because they're not going to take a linebacker. And what a huge, I just kicking myself after the draft. Why didn't we not talk about it? You just have to be one piece on one day. Just go, hey, by the way, these guys could be options for them. They're probably not going to take a linebacker, but here they are anyway. And this is why. And that's all. It could have been a paragraph and never talked about them once. So I'm going to learn from that, on the back of this combine, whatever the position, if there's a guy that screams Seahawks physical profile, we're going to talk about them. We're not going to make that mistake again. And, when you look at it this year, we're a year on. They've still got Wright and Wagner. They've got Cody Barton and Ben Burke-Irvin now. And, Pete Carroll has already talked about trying to bring back Michael Kendricks, who presumably is not going to cost a fortune because he's got an ACL. Mm-hmm. So they may be loaded again at linebacker, but I'm telling you now, if someone runs a 4-1-0 short shuttle at linebacker, I'm going to write a piece about them, because that is a Seahawks type of linebacker. And there are some decent linebackers in this draft. There's some guys who may test well. So might not be the biggest need. Still going to research this position this year.
Well, and when it comes to linebackers, I mean, you brought up KJ Wright on the blog too. The fact that a $7.5 million cap hit. He's the number 6th highest paid player on the team right now. And when you look at his age, and yes, he's great at diagnosing screens, but you look at the linebacker group last year, and there was a noticeable difference in speed among the starting players. And so I keep looking at KJ Wright, much like people are looking at Justin Britt as a potential cap casualty, or at least a guy to restructure his contract. I kind of look at KJ Wright through that same type of lens.
Yeah, I think you're right too. I think it's definitely it's a definite possibility. I mean, there's this again. This is the great thing about this offseason, is that
there's so much they could do.
There is, and in previous years, so when they're at the peak under the LOB era, they didn't have a load of needs. So you would kind of say, well, they kind of got a need at right tackle. Let's just focus on right tackles who fit their physical profiles. And they took like Jermaine Ifedi or something. He's like, great, what a great big surprise. That there were very few things to talk about. In previous years, they didn't have a lot of cap space, so they weren't going to be majorly aggressive in free agency. We kind of just sort of thought, well, they'll do a bit of business here and there, but they're not going to sign any huge free agent. But now they've got cap space. They've got loads of draft picks. The last few years, they've not had loads of draft picks. And they've got a lot they need to do, whether that's defensive line improvement, finding out what they're going to do on the O-line, getting another weapon for Russell Wilson. They've sorted the tight end need with Greg Olsen. And they've also got these guys like Justin Britt and Bradley McDougall and KJ Wright, Ed Dixon. They're going to cut these, there's a chance they could cut these guys. If they want to be really, really aggressive on the defensive line and sign Clowney and Everson Griffin and Jaron Reed and maybe another guy and fix the pass rush and fix the defensive line, because it's the one thing more than anything else that held them back last year, they're going to need cap space. And the way to create the cap space is to consider cutting Justin Britt and KJ Wright and Bradley McDougall and saying, okay, look, we're going to go in a different direction there. We're going to try and be cheaper, and we're going to use that money. And this is what you have to do in the NFL. It's about making your cap space work for you. Are you getting value for money if you have a cap hit of $10 million for KJ Wright? Is that $10 million best being used if it's given to your will linebacker when you've just drafted Cody Barton in the 3rd round? Is it not a case of you back yourself with Barton, you liked him, okay, didn't have a great rookie year, but you back Barton at the will, and then you use the $10 million on a $7.5 million, whatever it was, of the saving that you would get on to pay half a pass rusher or something like that.
Right.
Do you take Justin Britt out and say, okay, we're going to see if we can get somebody else, or hey, look, it won't be my pick, but do you just re-sign Joey Hunt for $1 million and say, well, look, he started most of last year, you start him again? I don't know. There's good centers. There's Cesar Ruiz, who's amazing, who could be a 1st-round option for them. There's Matt Hennessy. Watch the Senior Bowl things in full, as I mentioned. He looked a lot better than I initially thought. So he looks great. Looks like a 2nd-round pick. Lloyd Cushenberry fits a lot of the things that they look for. Nick Harris didn't have a great Senior Bowl, but they took Joey Barton. Would they take Nick Harris on day 3 for his tenacity and his grit and his physicality, even if he's undersized? Maybe. There's lots of different options and things they could do here. KJ would be a difficult one for them because clearly the team love KJ Wright.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It may cause a few issues. There may be 1 or 2 players who raise an eyebrow if they cut somebody as respected as KJ Wright. It may be that Justin Britt provides them an easier way to save some money there, but they'll probably like him as well. But these are all things that we have to consider. There are so many different factors to this offseason that you have to consider. And if they cut KJ Wright, and if they don't re-sign Michael Kendricks, then maybe they do look at the linebacker position. And there are, like I say, a few guys in this class who could run in those short shuttle time ranges that they would be on their radar.
Well, let's move on to day 4 on Sunday with the defensive backs. And we talked a little bit about it earlier, is the profile is pretty clear for a Seahawks corner. You can pretty much just look at the guy and tell if he's a Seahawks corner or not. And so when it comes to the field drills on Sunday, March 1st, I think the measurements on Thursday, the 27th, are going to be a big factor. But I'm curious about watching this particular group of defensive backs. And again, much like quarterback, it is a question of will they take one? I think when it comes to corner, will they take one in the 1st or 2nd round?
No, they probably won't. I mean, look, you could have a whole hour-long podcast on the merits of whether they should change their philosophy on that and take a cornerback early. And nobody would be right or wrong. You could make arguments for and against. The Seahawks have not been particularly good at cornerback for some time now. They've not drafted one of these late round gems. Trey Flowers has come in and done a sterling job for, a converted safety drafted in the 5th round to come in and start as a rookie and play 2 years. You're paying him absolutely nothing. It's cost you a 5th round pick. You can't criticize Trey Flowers for what he's delivered. I mean, he's delivered more than you could ever expect from that profile that I've just described there. And Shaquille Griffin's been pretty good. He
made the Pro Bowl.
He made the Pro Bowl. He had a decent year. In 2019, he got like 2 career interceptions or something, or 3.
He's lacking in the takeaways department for sure.
He doesn't have takeaways.
I think he had 2 in one game too, and that was a game against
Chicago.
Detroit. Chicago?
It was the Chicago game in week 2 last year. Yeah, he had 2 in that game, and then he had 1, I think, right at the end of his rookie season, and that's it. So not a turnover. They're probably going to end up paying him and keeping him because I think they love him. I think they love both Griffins. I think they're both amazing characters and worth having around, and that's. I remember Pete saying Tyler Lockett is everything that they want in a Seahawk when they re-sign him to a contract, and they'll probably use that exact same phrase when they re-sign Shaquille Griffin. Could they use more talent? Yes. The things about the scheme, the scheme and the way that they play and the amount of field that the cornerbacks have to cover, and it's all about the scheme. It's all about the technique. And they believe that they can coach guys up to play within that scheme and that they don't need necessarily the high picks at the positions. But here's the thing when I look at it, and this is the kind of counter I think we do, is I think they've only drafted, I'm just going to get the stat up here now. So they've only drafted 3 cornerbacks in the last 5 drafts. Now, in the first few years, it was like they kind of took one on day 3 every year. Mm-hmm. It was just like replenish the stock, bring the next guy in to try and trade up. Some of them didn't work, but doing that enabled them to find Walter Thurman and Richard Sherman and Byron Maxwell. But the wells run dry because other teams in the league are drafting these long cornerbacks earlier. So Isaiah Oliver's now a 2nd round pick, when maybe before Pete Carroll came on the scene, he's a 4th or 5th round pick. All of the teams are generally looking for the same type of cornerback now, and it's making it harder for the Seahawks to find their guys. Yeah. So should they consider taking one earlier? Just accepting defeat, accepting they're going to have to draft a cornerback earlier and do it in order to get some talent. I couldn't argue against that, but I just don't think they're going to do it. I think they will say, we like Shaquille, Trey can get better, but in year 3, we're going to see a jump there. And I think they're going to crack on, and they'll probably draft another cornerback for depth purposes on day 3, and that'll be that. But I will say, I think it's a good cornerback draft. I think there's some players who are going to test really well and measure really well and fit what the Seahawks look for. And if they broke the habit of a lifetime and took one early, it might not be the worst thing in the world.
What's the best drill to watch for corners?
I think it's the backpedal drill, which I think is being tweaked a little bit this year. I think that's one of the drills that's been tweaked. And I think they're going to time it as well. They've always timed it, but the teams have always got the information and the fans haven't. So I think we're going to get to see it time it out. But essentially it's to see how a cornerback transitions. Do they have the loose hips? Can they backpedal, switch and turn? So as they backpedal when they're in initial coverage and the deep ball gets thrown, can they flip the hips, get downfield, track the ball in the air? Those are the kind of things that they're going to have to do down after down after down. You can generally see how natural a cornerback is doing that on that drill. The W drill is going to be timed this year. That's another one. It's a good showing of footwork, whether it's smooth, is it labored at all? Can they get in and out? Can they move with fluidity? So those are the things that I would look at. And generally from size-wise, you're talking your 32-inch arms. You're talking a good vertical jump. You want to see them, 5'11" at the absolute shortest, preferably over 6 foot. And as I mentioned, I think there are some really good cornerbacks in this class who are going to fit that. Trevon Diggs, Stephon Diggs' brother's really good. CJ Henderson's probably going to run like a 3.8 in the short shuttle and is going to fly up boards as a consequence. Cam Dantzler at Mississippi State looks like a Seahawks cornerback. Jeff Okuda's going to
Cam Dantzler. That's like it's almost like when Deion Sanders came into the league. What was his name?
He was Leon Sandcats. It's like I don't know if you've ever seen South Park, but it was like Stan Marsh, and then they go more like Stan Darsh, and it's kind of like Cam Dantzler instead of Cam Chancellor. So it's but
That's
maybe he's destined to be a Seahawk. You've got Damon Arnett, and Tony Pauline's been talking about his combine preparation. Apparently, he's been reportedly quite poor, but he loves to hit in the running game. He's big, he's great in coverage. I think he's a really good player. There's other guys out there that, although I've not really studied the cornerback class because I wait to see who measures in the length department.
Right.
Who fits the kind of the Seahawks, but I know that there are people out there who. I mean, I've watched Jeff Gladney. He's very, very talented, and people like him. There's the cornerback at Utah that people really, really like as well. Jalen Johnson, that's his name. People really like him too. And there's probably a good 8 to 10 cornerbacks who will go in the first 3 rounds with potential early starting ability.
You draft Trayvon Diggs, and then you wait for his brother Stephon to throw a fit, and then you trade for him, around May, June, July timeframe, and then you don't even have to worry about drafting your number 3 receiver then.
Well, then you have 3 Diggses in the team as well. You've got Quandre, Stephon, and Trayvon Diggs.
Yeah, collect them all.
Trayvon Diggs is really good because he can track the ball in the air so well, and he's getting knocked a little bit because he had a bad end to the season. Jamar Chase gave him Jamar Chase could be a top 5 pick next year. So, I think he is better than people think. Look, CJ Henderson's really good. You've got really, really good cornerbacks in this draft. It's just you're going to see them probably playing somewhere else, and there'll be that one guy who's long with Trey Flowers had like 34-inch arms or 35-inch arms or something. They'll find somebody like that who runs the way they like and looks the way they like and tackles the way they like, and they'll up taking him in round 5.
Yeah, well, we could just plan on that because that does seem to be their MO, Pete Carroll's MO for sure. Let's move on to safety, where gosh, this is a position that is so difficult to project because at safety for the longest time, you had Earl Thomas, you had Cam Chancellor, and the Seahawks didn't really need to have a lot of success at that position. So it's not something they needed to focus on. They didn't need to draft early. So as a consequence, I feel like we don't really have any kind of good projections where it comes to, what type of player that they look for. Earl Thomas, even arm length, that doesn't come into consideration here because, Earl Thomas doesn't have like those 33-inch arms that you see with the other defensive backs. Quandre Diggs, you point out on the blog that he has sub 30-inch arms. So, these guys, they don't have to have long arms to be able to turn into a missile and take a guy out. So that seems to be the way guys like Diggs and guys like Earl Thomas seem to tackle. So when you are looking at this going into the draft, what should Seahawks fans really be looking for? And, or do you just say, hey, there's other traits that they might have to pick out and we'll just see what the Seahawks get?
Well, this is the reverse of the running back position. There's not really a characteristic that you could define as that's a Seahawks safety. Everybody is so different. I mean, the one thing I will say is that they have taken guys who love to hit. So, Earl Thomas loved to hit. Cam Chancellor loved to hit. Winston Guy was a big time hitter.
Oh yeah.
Ryan Murphy liked to hit. Marquise Blair was drafted because he is a good athlete, but also he hit like a sledgehammer as well. So they love guys who play with that kind of intensity. But then they've also taken so many. Mark Legree was a smaller school guy who was forced turnovers and was a bit of a playmaker. Tedrick Thompson at Colorado had 6 interceptions in his final season. Was like kind of a rangy safety who made a lot of plays at the second level. And, I think that's one of the reasons why they've kind of stuck with him, because he did have that natural playmaking ability. He just hasn't shown it in the NFL. Maybe that's because he's a limited athlete, because he's only like a 4.60 runner. Mm-hmm. Delano Hill was kind of this halfway house, was kind of a big nickel type rather than a stronger free safety at Michigan that kind of played him up in the box a lot and played him in run support. So, and had him covering the slot. So he was very, very different as well. There's nothing about any of them. They all kind of run different times. Earl Thomas is like a 4.3 runner, and then you've got guys running in, Winston Guy ran a 4.70. Quandre Diggs is like he got 29-inch arms and ran a 4.56. So there's nothing about them all that really stands out, and it makes it very hard to analyze how do you define a Seahawks safety. When you actually look at this safety class, it's not a good safety class. It's not particularly strong at all. I think you've got Grant. I love Grant Delpit. I can't believe that people are knocking him and sticking him in like the late first round. I just don't understand it whatsoever. I think he'll probably repair some of his stock at the combine when he tests very well. You've got Antoine Winfield Jr., who is, of course, that name will ring a bell, from Minnesota, who I think is going to go a bit earlier than people think. Xavier McKinney. A lot of people like Xavier McKinney. I don't think he's going to test particularly well. And I think he was used mostly as a blitzer at Alabama. And he's not going to do that. He's not going to have the luxury of doing that in the NFL too much. I don't really understand why he's established himself as like safety number one in this draft class. The one guy that I really like, though, is Kyle Duggar. Kyle Duggar at Lennar Ryan is a small school guy, so he's faced football adversity to even get to the point of being a potential NFL draft pick. Coming from the school that he does is credit to him. Amazing athlete, alpha male, big-time hitter. He's going to have an amazing combine, good size, very versatile, an amazing kick returner. Scored loads of touchdowns for the small school, just punt returns, kick returns, can do all of that. Probably can be used as a gunner. He may just end up going too early for the Seahawks. They've addressed safety in the last year with Marquise Blair's second-round pick and Quandre Diggs via trade. If they keep Bradley McDougald, I don't think they will cut both Tedrick Thompson and Delano Hill. There's a chance that one of them at least will be back.
Sure.
They drafted a Hugo Amadi in the 4th round. They've spent a lot of resource on the safety position. To spend another high pick on the position doesn't seem particularly likely to me. But Kyle Duggar just looks like a Seahawk. He looks like the kind of guy that is almost like the guy that we can't leave the draft without. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if with one of those second round picks, if they do get everything else done they need to do in free agency with their first 2 picks, if he was still there then in the first and then the second round, would they take him? But his buzz, Daniel Jeremiah is already saying he's going to put him in his top 50, in his next top 50 board. So he may even get into the first round discussion by the end of the combine.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of those small school guys that come out of nowhere. Usually we hear about it coming out of the Senior Bowl. But guys that I just think back to past drafts and some of those small school guys that end up, being in the first 2 rounds just based off of the hype and that they've built through either the Senior Bowl or through their athletic testing.
Well, there was a guy last year, I'm trying to pull up the draft now, who went pretty early, Nazir Adderley, who I wasn't a huge fan of. He was the number 60 overall pick to the Los Angeles Chargers. Wasn't the greatest tester and doesn't have, the backstory really of Kyle Duggar. He's a smaller school guy as well, but there's just something a bit special about Duggar. This, the size, the speed, the special teams, the intensity, the very mature personality, very humble guy, but has just got a bit of dog to him as well as an alpha male. If Nazir Adderley is a number 60 overall pick, then there's every chance that Kyle Duggar will be a top 50 pick. And, like I say, I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of this combine, if he runs in the 4.3s or something like that, and has an amazing workout, if he doesn't end up being a top 40 prospect by the end of this.
Well, Rob, it is going to be fun to watch this week coming up and seeing how these players do, and all the more that we'll have to talk about going into the weeks leading up to the draft, because yes, you're going to be able to start scouting some of those cornerbacks after Thursday and see where they go. And we're going to see exactly how these guys fit and tend to be within the Seahawks profile. So looking forward to all that. And people, be sure to go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com and check it out. Follow Rob on Twitter @Rob Staton. And Rob will be looking forward to talking more maybe after the combine.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't wait. Always provides a lot of information. We're kind of on the stretch now to the really interesting part of the offseason with the combine and free agency and then moving up to the draft. Huge offseason for the Seahawks. It's going to be a lot of fun. They're going to be very aggressive and they're going to get a lot done.
And with that, there's only one thing left to say. Go Hawks.